Hello and welcome. Thanks so much for stopping by and checking out the channel today. My name's Tobias. I'm a freelance filmmaker, an editor, and a DaVinci Resolve certified user. Now in today's video, I'm really excited to show you a film emulation plugin called Dehancer. Now Dehancer is designed specifically to be used with DaVinci Resolve, and as of recording this video, which is June 2021, it's only available on the Mac OS operating system. That being said, they do say on their website that they're trying to get it out to Windows this year. So depending on when you're watching this video, I'd say just go over to their website and check and see if it's available on Windows, and of course I'll leave a link for that in the description. Okay, and just quick disclaimer before we jump into the video, the folks over at Dehancer did reach out to me and ask if I'd be interested in checking out the plugin and making this little video here, and they are also supplying me with the pro version of the plugin for this tutorial. Now, that being said, nothing that I'm saying here I've been told to say or anything like that. These are all just my own opinions and my own thoughts on the plugin after using it. The only thing they ask is if I could head over to the website and check out their blog, which has a bunch of really insightful articles about how they made the plugin, and also, tutorials on how to use specific features, which I would also highly recommend to anyone watching this video. I'll leave a link, of course, in the description to the blog. I would just go through and read any of the articles that look like they would be, important to what you're learning. Because of course the plugin has a bunch of different features in it, so they have different blog posts, related to specific features. But really, I would just head over there and check it out. There's a lot of really important information. Okay, so let's get right into it. I don't want to go crazy in depth with it because there's just so much. Again, like I said, check out the blog because there's so much detailed information. But that being said, I think what I want to do is kind of split this video up into three parts. To start, I want to talk about just a little bit of backstory with the plugin, how they made it, how it's put together, and really what sets it apart from other, film emulation plugins. Secondly, of course, will be the tutorial segment where I'll actually go into Resolve and show you how to use the plugin and what specific settings do, and we'll just take a couple shots and go through and grade those. And then lastly will be some of my closing thoughts and sort of who I think, this plugin is really made for, and a few things that I noticed that I think would be really cool to see in future updates. So of course, if you would prefer to just jump straight to the section where I'm showing you how to use the plugin in DaVinci Resolve, there will be a navigation bar down at the bottom, but just wait. I can see you just going down there and just skipping right over all this. There is some really important stuff in this intro segment that I want to talk about. I'm going to keep it pretty brief because I know this overall video is probably going to end up being quite long. So if you do want to skip, feel free, but there is some important info right here at the beginning. Okay, so to kick things off here, I just want to talk quickly about how they made the plugin and just touch on a few topics here and a few things that they mention on their website. I mean, just for instance, how they spent 5 years developing the Dehancer plugin, and they even had to kind of invent new processes and all of this crazy technical stuff in order to accurately capture film. Because there's so much more that you don't really think about, I think, when you take sort of other plugins or even just a film grain overlay and you throw it onto your footage, and it does look good. But really, after reading through all of the posts on their website, there's just so much more that you don't realize goes into it. And film is a really difficult thing to replicate, and all of the little nuances and all the little the details that just kind of spontaneously will occur. And I think that really Dehancer is probably the closest that you're going to get to an actual, accurate one-to-one representation of film using a digital image. I mean, of course, it's impossible to recreate film one-to-one because it's a natural, organic process. So it's impossible to recreate that. But I do think, just from my brief time spent messing with the plugin and reading on their website, it definitely seems to me like it's the closest you're going to get. Like a little quote from their website here, they say all profiles are built around sampling the real analog media combined with nonlinear image processing. And that we have studied all modern approaches and software solutions for 3D color morphing with tables, and we have found that there's no perfect mathematical model so far, so we had to create our own. See, things like that. Like, they just made their own mathematical equation as, again, another just part of this process, just a piece of the puzzle. So really, just to wrap this segment up, I think that, if you do get this plugin, you're in good hands because they put the work in, they did the research, and I think it's a really powerful tool. Alrighty, so without further ado, let's head over to DaVinci Resolve and I'll show you how you can use the different features inside Dehancer Pro. Okay, so here we are in Resolve 17. I have a couple of clips pre-balanced and ready to go. They have different visual characteristics, and I'll explain why in just a moment here. If you're wondering about compatibility with Dehancer, you're just going to need to be on DaVinci Resolve 15 or later, and also on macOS Mojave 10.14 or later. So those are the software specs you'll need. Okay, so I've just done a couple of things here. I've got my color space transform set up. This was shot in log on Blackmagic Pocket 4K. So I've got my CST set up here to transform it to the timeline color space, which is just Rec. 709. So these are all pretty much ready to go. And you can see that one of them is kind of very low contrast. Right here, you can see there's a lot of light. And I mean, there are some shadows and some details there, but it's pretty flat. And then this one is very contrasty, just kind of baked in. So I'll show you kind of why I chose these two shots in a minute. So I have my Dehancer node ready and set up. I didn't do anything specific here. I just created a serial and named it Dehancer. You will find Dehancer in your Open Effects, and for me, it's all the way at the bottom. I'm not sure where it's exactly it will be on your system, but I assume it'll probably be at the bottom here. This is, I'm running a beta right now, by the way, just, the naming will probably be different for you, but if you're just wondering, this is the beta. So I'm just going to drag it, drop it on, and you'll see right away it makes some visual changes. So I'm just going to jump into full screen, which is just Shift F, and you'll notice that will keep your Open Effects window over here, so you can continue to make changes. Okay, so you can see that I've got, in the input section, it's set to Rec. 709. This is fine because, like I said, I have my CST set up, and the output color space is set to use timeline, which, if we go into the project settings here, you'll see that my timeline color space is Rec. 709. So that's fine for this. But of course, if you wanted to go directly from your camera, just like a log shot from your camera, they do have some presets right here. So for example, if I were to just take this right here, I've gotten rid of those other nodes, and I just have the log shot straight from my camera. There's no settings, there's no balancing applied, no CST. And what you can do is come to choose camera, and then say, for this, it's Blackmagic, camera is Pocket Cinema 4K, and the format is film. And you'll see it balances that out for you. Occasionally you can get some clipping though in the highlights and some crushing in the shadows. I would kind of recommend just doing your CST beforehand, like in this version we have here. I just kind of think it works a little bit better. It sort of keeps everything protected. And then you can just go into the Dehancer plugin and say source Rec. 709, which is the default. And it's kind of just a little bit easier. So I would recommend doing that. Okay, so I'm going to go through these settings here. I'm not going to go really in depth. I know I've mentioned this a lot in this video already, but I would highly recommend checking out their website, where they have articles on their blog all about every one of these settings. I do want to give you a good understanding of what everything does, but really you have to understand that it's only just scratching the surface, and there's so much more to it all. And to really learn all of that, you're going to have to check out their website, because it would just take an incredibly long time to explain what all of these things do. Okay, so right off the bat, you've got, of course, all of your input settings, and the next is your film profile. Right here, by default, it's set to Kodak Vision 3 250D, and this is why I have these two differently balanced shots. Okay, like I said before, this one is sort of very flat, and this is very contrasty. So this is just a quick example of the different film profiles and what they do. So right now, the Kodak Vision, the Vision 3 250D, this is a high contrast profile. So it's designed for a lot of light, and if you use it on footage that's already very contrasty, you're going to probably lose information in the shadows. You're going to clip a little bit. So that's why it works really well for a shot like this, because it's fairly flat. It's not really contrasty as it is. So for example, if we switched this to the Kodak Vision 3 50D, you'll see everything gets much more flat. And if we switch it back to the 250, it's more contrasty. That's because the 50D is a low contrast. So this is for like daylight exteriors with a lot of contrast baked into the shot already. So for this example, we're going to keep this to Kodak Vision 3. And then for this clip, we would set that probably to the 50D because there's a lot of contrast here already. Next up, you've got your push and pull setting. So what this does essentially is, and they explain this on their website, every film profile, there are essentially 3 versions of it. There's the standard, and then there's underexposed by -2 and overexposed by +2. So this setting essentially lets you transition smoothly between those. So you can see as I pull it back, it sort of introduces more contrast. As I push it up, it becomes more flat. And it's very dynamic. It adjusts, you know, contrast and saturation and everything all at the same time. But that's basically what that is. You know, there's 3 versions essentially of every profile at different exposure levels. Next, we have the expand tool. So this is essentially, this will give you manual control over your black point and your white point. So you can pull your white up, you can pull your black down if you want it more contrasty. And then down here, you can set it to Luma, which essentially, as you're making these changes, then it won't affect the saturation of the image at all. It'll only be affecting the luminance. So next up, we have your print settings down here where you can adjust things like exposure, contrast, color density, and the saturation. And next up down here, we have the color head setting. You can think of this in a similar way to your printer lights here in DaVinci Resolve, you know, or here in your offset. So as you adjust these, for example, yellow and blue, so as you adjust these, you can see the changes taking effect here: magenta, green, cyan, red, and yellow, blue. You can also check the gang box here, which sort of links them all together, and then they work in unison. And then you've got preserve exposure down here and the overall impact. So if we were to make a change like this, then you could take the overall impact of the whole effect down. And they have a whole blog post up on their site talking all about this feature alone, because as you would expect, it's not, you know, exactly the same as printer lights in DaVinci Resolve. This is based off of a very analog and whole physical process. So I would recommend checking that out again. And of course, down here, we have settings for film grain. So I'm just going to punch in a little bit here so you can see this better. And of course, you know, you have all of the settings that you would expect, for instance, size and amount. Now, the cool thing about the grain in Dehancer is that it's really different from most other plugins and overlays. The grain in Dehancer, it's not just placed on the image as an overlay, it's generated based off of specific characteristics in your shot. And to quote their website, they say, "Our algorithm generates grain based on local color and brightness characteristics of the image, and thus is always related to it." Which is really awesome, and, you know, similar to a lot of other things in Dehancer, this is just a really organic way of approaching it, and this mimics the analog, sort of the real film effect, much better than just throwing an overlay on top, because the film grain will always be specific to your shot. One thing you might be wondering about here is the film resolution setting. This essentially lets you either, as you crank it down, you can sort of blur and soften your footage, and as you push it up all the way to the top, you can essentially retain the full resolution of your original shot by putting it all the way up to 100. So I would kind of recommend softening it just a little bit so that it doesn't look too sharp underneath the grain. And of course, you have separate controls for shadows, midtones, and highlights. So if you come into the highlights here, for example, and I just take my highlights and bring it all the way down, you can see how much grain disappears in the highlights. It's really cool. And then you've got your chroma slider. So if you don't like any color in your noise, you can take this all the way to 0 and it will remove any colorization, or you can crank it all the way up and you can see you're getting much more color in the noise itself. And next up, we have settings for halation. So this is just another one of those visual things that you're going to notice when you're working with old film. If we just turn this on, you might not see a lot happening right away, apart from the image getting slightly warmer. But if we click into mask mode here, you can start to see exactly the affected area. So for instance, if we turn up the local diffusion and maybe amplify a little bit, so you can better see this. And then we turn mask mode off. You can see as I disable and re-enable these little outlines, these borders that are red and a little bit orange, just kind of blooming from the highlights here. Now again, they have a whole article on their website explaining kind of the history behind this and exactly why this effect appears on film. Essentially, this is just another one of those little details, those little things. It's a characteristic of shooting on film, and they've recreated it pretty amazingly here in Dehancer. So you can mess around with this. It might not be for everyone, but I think it just adds a little bit more authenticity to it. I would recommend just going into mask mode when you're first starting to mess with this, because then you can really kind of see the effects, and then it's a lot easier to kind of get it dialed in. Of course, you have all your normal settings for things like diffusion and the amplify setting. You can also shift the hue of these outlines right here. The source limiter, this will essentially kind of dial it in and target more of the extreme highlights, and as you pull it back, it'll kind of open that up so it's grabbing more than just really bright areas. Now with your background gain setting, you can adjust the level of brightness of the backgrounds upon which the halation effect is sitting. And then you've got your blue comp setting here. Essentially what this does is if the halation effect is applied to a shot that has a very blue background, this will kind of help compensate for that. This will help make up for that, because the blue can often overpower the halation effect. And so you've got this blue comp slider, which will sort of counteract that and kind of increase the halation effect. Next up we have bloom, and if we just turn this on here, you can see it taking effect right away, and I will just pull into some areas like this. If I turn it off and turn it on, you can see it taking effect immediately. And if we click into mask mode, we can see exactly all of the affected areas. So this, again, another characteristic of film. It's kind of that classic look of the very soft and sort of glowing highlights and the blooming around bright areas. And again, they've recreated it really wonderfully in here and given you complete control over everything. First up, you've got your highlights slider, and this essentially sets the threshold, so the further back you pull it, only the brightest areas of the image are going to be affected. And you can see that taking effect here as I pull it down. Your details slider here defines the size of the area which produces the bloom. So a minimum value is going to correspond to small objects, for example, thin foliage against a bright sky background. Maximum values correspond to large objects, for example, a bright window pane viewed from inside a room. The higher the value is in the details slider, the larger objects are going to be affected. So you can see as we pull it back, all of these smaller areas of the sun coming through the leaves are starting to sort of dip away. And as we push it up, a lot more is coming out. Diffusion, this is just going to kind of soften and spread the effect. Amplify is sort of just an overall amplification, so you're increasing the effects of everything. Save lights, this controls the brightness value of highlights affected by bloom. So a bigger value basically adds more highlight protection. So as you pull it back, everything's going to get brighter, and of course we're probably going to be clipping on our scopes, so that's why you probably want to keep it set somewhere up here. And then, of course, you have the total impact of the entire effect on your image. Next up we have vignette. Of course, it's pretty self-explanatory. You can throw a vignette on here. I've found an easy way to control this, because there's no physical window like you would get with power windows and Resolve, is if you just take your feather all the way down, you're going to get a really clear, definitive edge, and then you can sort of make your adjustments. Once you've got it sitting where you want it to be, then you can take your feather and crank it back up. Next up, we have the film breath setting. I can't, unfortunately, demo this in the best possible way, because I would need to be able to get real-time playback. And of course, with the Dehancer plugin applied, it does take a lot of processing power. But essentially, film breath is noticeable as an accidental change in exposure, contrast, and color from frame to frame as the film moves. Again, this is just another characteristic of shooting on film. There are imperfections, and so this gives you another kind of level to that, and you can come through here and mess with all of the settings, and you're basically going to get, exactly as they say on their site, it's an accidental change in exposure, contrast, and color from frame to frame. So it's going to mimic that kind of flickering and slight movement that you'll get with old film. Down here we have the gate weave setting. As they say on their site, this is a commonly used term that refers to the mechanical swinging of a film strip while it is being pulled through a frame window in a film camera, projector, or video coding device. This is going to give your film just a little bit of jitter and a little bit of movement. You've got all your settings to control this down here. As with the film breath, I can't preview it really as it should be because you would need real-time playback, and Dehancer does take a lot of processing power. And another little snippet from their website, they say that gate weave is most evident when the mechanical components of a camera or projector are imperfect. It's particularly noticeable in old movies, see for example Charlie Chaplin, as well as with amateur Super 8, 8, and 16mm cameras. The gate weave artifacts also become more prominent when the old film with worn perforations is reeled in. False color, so this is going to give you a really good look at where your shots are peaking and the shadows and everything in between, so this is just a nice little extra feature to have. You've got output total impact, so this is going to take everything in the plugin and just adjust the effects of it all in one slider. And then lastly down here we have the LUT generator. Of course, something to keep in mind is that, a LUT is never going to be able to store all of the information that you have in here, and that's why, again, on their website they stress that Dehancer is not a LUT. And it's a process, it's a plugin, there's a lot more to it. So as you can generate LUTs with this, you're not going to get a lot of the visual features and a lot of the changes that you make in here. And that's it, that's Dehancer. I know I've said it 100 times already, but I would highly recommend checking out their website and checking out their blog because everything that I've just gone over here, I've barely scratched the surface, and they have a blog post for almost every single one of these different settings. So I would highly, highly recommend checking that out and reading up on all of these. And then you're just going to be able to approach it with that much more intent and armed with the proper knowledge. Alrighty, so that's how you use the Dehancer Pro plugin in DaVinci Resolve. So to wrap things up here, I just have a few kind of like closing thoughts, some things I noticed while going through the plugin that I think would be cool to see changed in future updates or added or something like that. And then also, of course, you're probably wondering, how much does the plugin itself cost? Where can you get it? All of that. You can buy a license to the plugin from Dehancer's website, which is just dehancer.com. And of course, I'll leave a link in the description. The Pro version of the plugin is $350, which I think also sort of leads into this segment of like, who is it for? Should you really get it? And all of that, which I'll talk about in a minute. But also there are different versions of the plugin, so you don't just have to get the Pro version. They have, additionally, Dehancer Light is one of them. You can get just grain, you can get just bloom, just halation, and just breath. Also, they have a photo edition, which still just works in DaVinci Resolve. So of course there is Dehancer Pro for $350. They have Dehancer Light, which is $149. This just lacks a few of the features of the Pro version, but it still has, grain, bloom, defringe vignette, false colors, and a number of other tools, including all of the 58 film profiles. That option is a lot more affordable and you still get most of the Pro features in it, so that I think would be a good choice if you don't really want to go all the way and get the Pro version. Dehancer Grain is $39, so you can just get the grain effect itself. Bloom is $49, Halation is $79, and Breath is $49. And then the Dehancer Photo Edition is $99. Now I believe all of these come with 2 seats, which I assume means that you can use the plugin on 2 different systems. So if you have a desktop setup and then a laptop setup, you can use the plugin on either of those. I don't know that 100%, but I'm assuming that's what 2 seats means. So with that being said, who is Dehancer really made for? And I think that ultimately, when it comes down to buying it, that decision has to be up to you and your specific requirements and your needs. But I would say if we're just looking at the Dehancer Pro, which is $350, I really think that Dehancer is meant for people who want to go that next step and take it to the next level. There's a lot of kind of color science and a lot of more detailed, like harder to understand stuff in there. You can totally take it and just throw it on and use it, but if you're spending $350, you're probably wanting to go that next step and have more fine control over it. And as there is a lot that you can do with it by just throwing it on and using it like that, I think really where its full potential comes out is when you read the blog posts, when you really get in depth and understand what each of the individual tools in Dehancer does. So I think, yeah, for a pro user, for a colorist who wants to take it to that next level, Dehancer Pro is a great option. But I think, for anyone else, Dehancer Lite, which comes in at $150, is probably a really great option. And of course, like I mentioned before, if you want to just get the grain or another one of the effects like bloom or halation, then you can just individually purchase those. And then of course there are still overlays and things like Film Convert and other plugins that you can check out too if you don't want to get really in depth. But I think, like I said in the intro, Dehancer is probably the closest that you're ever going to get to a real one-to-one match using a digital file and trying to get that film look. I think it's probably as close as you're going to get. Now, a few things that I noticed that I thought would be cool to see changed or added in future. One of those things was in the output total impact section at the bottom there, where you kind of change the total effect of the plugin itself. You'll notice in almost every other OFX plugin in DaVinci Resolve, that section is called Global Blend. And when I was first going through, looking through Dehancer and looking at all the different features, when I saw the output like total impact spot, I wasn't 100% sure what it meant, and then I was like, oh right, it's sort of the effect of the plugin overall. So that's one thing that I feel like would be kind of cool, maybe in a future update, to change the total impact to just say global blend to match like all of the other plugins in Resolve. It might just help make it easier and more understandable for people who are using Resolve and are familiar with how everything's worded and how it's all put together. I also understand that they have their own system and they name things in a very accurate way and a very true to life way as far as the analog process. So that could also be referring to that too. But it's just a thought. Having it be global blend would make it easier to recognize, on first glance. Also, I thought maybe like some way of switching between the film profiles faster, or well, not faster, but just making the navigation a little bit easier because there are so many of them. Maybe categories or a different UI for switching between the profiles. I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it right now, but because there are so many of them, it might be cool to have a different sort of layout for that, a different UI, just to make it a little bit easier to navigate. And then lastly, one other thought I had was to build in more camera profile presets. Like when I was going to set up mine, I shoot on a Blackmagic Pocket 4K quite frequently. And I noticed, I don't know if it was just detecting that's what I had, that's what the footage was, but when I went to Blackmagic Design, that was the only profile there was for the Pocket 4K. And I think I've seen in some other videos people talking about, it's a little bit limited with the profiles that they have installed. I don't know, it's just a thought, maybe adding more common camera profiles. Although, like I showed in the video, it can be easier to just do your CST, your color space transform before even going into Dehancer, because that way you can just set it to Rec 709 or whatever color space you're working in. And then you can just plumb that right into Dehancer and use the color space setting instead of the camera profile. Alright, so that pretty much wraps this video up. Thank you so much for watching. If you're interested in seeing more like this, leave a like on the video or subscribe to the channel if you want to follow along. Also a huge shout out and thank you to Dehancer for letting me check out the plugin and make this little video here. It's been really fun, and thank you to them for just being super sweet and making the whole process seamless. Okay, so that's it for me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.